All right, so part 3 and 4 of lesson 2 or week 2, we talked about a little bit about your assignment number 1, which is due in a couple weeks. Part 4, we talked about, we kind of finished off the whole idea of platform, players, and modes, that kind of thing. And now we're going to get back into into Blender. So if you guys can bring up your Blender interface, please. Now you should have it in front of you. If you don't, you're going to have to install it. But I'm not sure if you guys can see well for this one. We're in a different room than we were last time. All right, so last time when we talked about a couple of things, let's go over just a review, right, what we talked about with Blender last time, if you weren't here or if you missed pieces. So we talked about different kinds of meshes. And again, from a tooling perspective, the cube is something that we started off with. We started off with the cube, and we kind of changed elements of the cube. And then we started with Shift A, we went and kind of created our first or our second sphere, right? Here's our UV sphere. And then from there, we kind of took our UV sphere and split it 32 ways, right? 32 rings. And then from there, when we went into our edit mode, we went into front view. Let's see if I can actually make this go into front view. Come on, baby. There we go. And in front view, into front ortho. And from there, what we did was we split this thing in half, and we went into this, we used the wrench tool on the right, which is this modifier tool, add modifier, after we split this in half, and we kind of did mirroring mode, right? In mirroring mode, we did half the object, and then the other half of the object started to kind of work as we worked. And the way to do that, of course, is to deselect all. We used the B select mode, the B tool. Right, we went into wireframe mode. I'm just going to kind of zoom in here a little bit more so you can see. Just as a recap, right, we went to B select tool and we selected half of the mesh. This is what we did, right half of the mesh or the left half of the mesh, and then we used X and we deleted all the vertices. And what that did was created like this half sphere, if you will. I think I did it actually a little better than last time because I don't have any remnants. Let me take a look. All right, I didn't. All right, cool. And once we got the half sphere idea, right? I'm just going to move this up a little bit. Here's my half sphere. All right. Once we got that half sphere, what we did was I highlighted everything, I kind of selected everything, and then went into this little wrench mode on the top, just to recap, and I chose add modifier, and I chose this mirror modifier idea. So even though we're only working with half the sphere, the other half of the sphere will appear as we work with this half. That's the whole idea. And then from there, what I asked you to do was go back into a solid mode, zoom in, and start creating your first face, right? And that's what we did. We kind of created a face, if you will. That's how we started off. Nice, but we didn't really have any colors. And so far, we haven't really talked about colors, how to color your solids, or anything like that. So let's go and do that today. Let's start off. So I'm going to start off with a new Blender file. Right, here we are. And this time we'll leave it as the cube, right? But I want to talk about materials a little bit. So again, looking at the right interface here, you see there's a bunch of different elements. And one of them we hit was this wrench tool, right? The other one I want you to get into right now, if you look at this circle, the sphere, there's a little circle near the right. It's the fourth tool from the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And this is inside our right kind of toolbar or the right sidebar. If you click onto it, it shows material. Right now, if you notice, the material it shows you a preview of lighting, but right now it's showing us a sphere, which doesn't make any sense. If we're using a cube object, we might as well go into cube form. If you notice on the right-hand side here, you can actually choose a cube, so you can see what the cube would look like rendered in the color that we're going to render it. Right now, if you notice, the default, which is right here, is called material. This is the default name for our color. Think about materials as the type of color that you're going to, or shade that you're going to put on your object. Now, you don't have to color the whole object. You can choose to create your materials first and then apply the materials in different sections, right? But for now, let's make it so that the whole object is a color. Let's start off with that, right? So here's my tool, and if you notice, I've got a material here, and the material is just named material. If you look down here in this area, you see that there's a couple of aspects. There's one aspect or attribute which is called diffuse. You see that? Diffuse. And there's another one that says specular. If I click inside the diffuse area, right, it gives me a color wheel, right? The color wheel tells me what color my material will be. And if I color it, right now let's make it more green, type green-like. Take a look. Here's my green-like material. My whole object changes color, right, so it becomes green. Now, we can also choose of different types of materials. Right now, the standard is Lambert, right? There's also Fresnel, and so on, different kinds of material. Right now, leave it at Lambert because as we move towards other types of material, they give you different kinds of effects, right? Especially when it comes to lighting and shadowing, right? That's the idea with materials. Materials are, they keep track of our reflections, they keep track of our lighting and shadowing. That's what materials do. How they respond to lighting and shadow. All right? Okay, take a look at specular now. Specular is the kind of, if I go back to my circle, just to give you an idea, here's my sphere on the right hand side. It shows you this little area here as an example. And this is a good way of looking at it as well, of what it's going to look like when the light is kind of cast onto it. Right now, my specularity is the reflection, how much reflectivity the object has. Right? So here's our color, and here's our specularity. If I move this specularity up, if you notice the intensity of specularity, it becomes more and more intense. See how the actual object becomes more intensely specular. If I go back down the other way, right, it becomes less and less intense, or less and less specular, less and less reflective until it's purely matte. So there's no reflectivity here at the other end, 0. You can also obviously choose a number. So instead of making it like, pulling it up, I can just pull this bar up and back like this. I can also choose more or less reflectivity as I go, right? This is important because you may want your object to be more reflective or less reflective or no reflective, right? You can do the same thing with diffuse. If I go up here, I can actually pull diffuse down to make it more dark, almost black, or all the way up to make it almost like a lot brighter. So this is almost the intensity of how bright the material is in terms of the color that you've chosen. So more intense, a lot lighter, less intense, darker, right? We're looking in the middle, approximately in there, right? That's where we start off. I think that's a really good starting point for us when we look at when it comes to materials. So this is the material that we made, a material that is green, as an example. Our square or cube is green, but it's all one color. Well, to demonstrate this, right now we've made it green. Let's rename the material. If I actually click in here, I can rename the material a color that I want. For example, green. Right? Now, once I've named the material, I can access it later on with code. I can access it with different things. Right now, for example, our material is called green. We can call it green cube type material, green, whatever you want to call it, or grass, or whatever you want to make it. You can make it whatever it means to you in the context you're using it. Right now, for us, it's just going to be a green material. All right, in the middle, and again, I've made my screen. I've kind of pulled my sidebar closer. That's why it looks like this. I'm going to move it to the side a little bit more now. And in where my material is, remember, when I create a new mesh, right, which is this object that I've got in here, it always appears wherever my three-dimensional cursor is. Right now, my three-dimensional cursor is in the direct middle, right? And I can set that. I can kind of move my three-dimensional cursor by selecting Shift S. So it says move my cursor to my selected. I can move cursor to center. I can move cursor to grid. I can move cursor to active. There's different options. Right now my cursor's in the center. But let's say it wasn't. Let's say I clicked away by accident, left-clicked over here, right? So my cursor's over here. And I want to put it back in the middle because I want my object to appear here, not over there, right? Again, it's Shift S. That's the shortcut key. And then I go cursor to center, right? Cursor to center. And that goes right back to the middle again. Okay? Now I want to add a plane. So I'm going to say Shift A for add, right? I'm going to go mesh plane. But my plane appears like we did this before. It's actually inside of my cube. That's where the plane is, right? I want this plane, it's still selected, but I want this plane to be bigger. So let's go S for scale, right? And I want to choose 15. I'm just actually type in the number 15 in there for the scale of my object. Yep. Tell me which step. How do I select plane? Okay, let me go back. I'll just undo. Okay, so here with my cube, my cursor's in the middle. Shift A takes me to my mesh menu. I'm going to choose plane. My plane appears, you can see the outline of the plane that's inside of my cube right now, right? I'm going to go, without touching anything else, I'm going to click S. And then I'm going to type the number 15, and it actually makes my plane, it scales my plane up. Okay, my plane, if you notice, my cube is kind of halfway into my plane, right? Yeah? You see what I see? Okay, cool. What I'd like to do, because my plane is selected, you see that the plane here itself, here's my plane, and if you notice, it's selected. I'm going to try, my handlebars then are not because of my cube, they're because of my plane. This selector, these handles, if you will, right? It's all around my plane. So if I actually take this Z arrow and pull it down, I'm actually going to make the plane go appear below my cube. See, I can just move it up and down. Below my cube, which is where I want it. Okay, so let's put it below. All right, now, if you notice on the right, I still have my material object selected. This is my material icon, right? I want to click New, right? I want to create a new material for my object. Now, if you notice, I don't have the option to choose green. How come? Why? It only belongs to my cube right now. It doesn't belong anywhere else, right? Except if I go here. If I go here, instead of creating a new material like I did, I can select green, right, as an object. If I do that, then my ground also becomes green, right? If I want to deselect that, make my ground another color, I can go back to that material, that new material I just made, which is just called material. Let's leave it at material, the original material we chose. And again, I went to this little material object right here, and I just chose between green and material. Again, don't worry if you can't get all this. I'm recording it all. So you can always go back and look at the recording again and see what I did. Okay, so I want to make this ground kind of a brown, right? So how do we do that? Igor, what do we do to make this ground more of a brown color? Where did I go to choose my color? Diffuse. That's where I go. You're correct. I go here, I click diffuse once, it pops up my color wheel. Now I want to make it more brown, which is kind of in between this orange, reddish, yellow kind of area right here, right? So I want to kind of pull this little dot, which is the middle. This is my color dot. I want to kind of pull it towards the brown, right? Just down in here, right? So kind of more of a brownish orange kind of color. My ground is brown. There we go. Now again, if you don't want to pull it down like this, look at the color wheel. You can also choose HSV type colors, so manually put in a specific color. A hexadecimal color that you're used to from the web. You can choose specific colors from an RGB perspective, so you don't have to be so random. You can be specific if you'd like to, right? Then you just, if you notice over here on the right, that's the value, that's how bright my color is. So I can make it as dull or as bright as I want towards the white end of the spectrum, or I can dull it down, and it actually changes my values down here, right? Okay, let's click away. And if I click away, I have kind of this light brown color that I have for my ground. If you want to have the same color as I do, let's try this. I want you to go into the hex color and put in FAB669 in the hex color. And now we have the same color, you and I, for my ground. Okay, so FAB669 will be your hexadecimal color that you're going to put in there. And then you can have the same color as I do. You did that already? You may not want to. You're slow, or you couldn't do it? FAB669. Doesn't matter. I'm just trying to show you that there's other ways of matching colors, right? That's the reason why it is. Okay, cool. I'd like to, rename this thing, and the best practice is to rename all of our materials. So I want to go in here, and again, I'm going to pull this out to make it easier to see. I'm going to go in here and just click onto it once and change my color to like a light brown. And what I want to do is make it like a variable name. So I don't want to put spaces in here. I want to put light brown in there. And now my light brown material's in there. Right, so light brown is the color of my ground. Okay, cool. I've got my material, I've got my stuff, right? And remember, we're playing the game side of things, right? We're not just doing rendering to make lovely cups and vases that you can see online how to make, right? We're doing it for gaming, right? So I want to change this render mode. Right now we're in Blender Render. I want to change the render mode from Blender Render, which is the top of your screen, to Blender Game. Let's do that. Blender Render to Blender Game. It doesn't change anything here, but it does change the capabilities we have to actually make it a game. Okay, Blender Render to Blender Game. Okay, cool. I want to click N to bring up my numeric menu on the right. And if you go down, we're going to talk about shading a little bit. I want you to move away from multi-texture shading when it comes to game stuff. Right, here's my multi-texture shading. It's under the shading option. I want you to move away from there into something called GLSL. Right, GLSL. GLSL gives us a different, more realistic shading for games only, right? And this is the way we should do it. And this is not just shading, it's also the way lighting works for us and for games as well. Okay, we can make this thing go away. Press N again. So now we have GLSL set. Right? By the way, you can set GLSL for texturing mode in Blender Render mode, not just Blender Game. When I select this top up here, this area here, it's the type of rendering engine that I'm going to use to create my objects. Right now we're in the Blender Game rendering engine. Okay, there's different ones. The one that's most complex, that takes the longest and is completely different, right, is cycles render mode, right, which makes more realistic images. If you want to make a cup that looks real, right, you can use cycles render to make reflections and transparencies and everything else to make it look like a real surface. If you want to make an image, if you're an artist and you want to do something in 3D, cycles render is the way to go. If you want to make a game, Blender Render, Blender Game is the way to do stuff. Gaming mode, if you go to Blender Game, it allows me to use logic bricks to control my objects. Okay, lots of words there. All right, right now we've always been in this solid mode, and sometimes we go into wireframe mode. Here's wireframe mode, right? And you can kind of toggle in and out of there by pressing the Z button, remember? Okay, that's cool. But sometimes you want to see things in material mode. If I click material mode, it actually shows me a little bit of lighting, right, of what the lighting looks like for our object. Take a look. So now I clicked over here, right? I don't know if you guys, I'll pull it up so you guys can see it. Hold on. Right here. See this object right here, this item? We're still in object mode, but I've clicked different ways of my viewport shading right now is on material, not on solid. So material. I've clicked material. And now what I'm getting is this, realistic lighting and shading right now from a game perspective. This is like low poly kind of shading, right, that I can use for games. Do you see what I see? Okay, I'm going to zoom out. Right, I've still got my plane selected. And if you notice, this is my light source up here. I'm going to right click on my light source. This is my light source. So if I want to move this light source around, see how the shadowing and the lighting moves around, right? I've got almost like a point lamp that I'm using right now. It kind of shines equally in all directions, right? Now, when we talk about materials, we have to also talk about a little bit of lighting, right? Otherwise, materials don't matter. Okay, so there we go. Here's our lighting. It's a point lamp. And if you notice when we talk about the outline a little bit, let me just pull this down a little bit here. On the top right corner, you have some items that are listed here. There's lamp, cube, plane, right, and so on, and camera. If I want to change my ground, my plane, so it says ground, I just have to rename it up here. So I just click on this plane, I click on it again, or double click, and then I can change my plane to say ground. So I'm actually naming my material, my objects, right? And it's the same thing with my cube. Let's say my cube is actually my player, right? So instead of my cube, I right click on my cube to select it, or I double click on this and I call this player, right? I can name my objects, and naming is very important because then you can control your objects, right, with code. Right now, we're not going to use code, but it's good to prepare yourself and to name your assets. In Unity, when we get into Unity, this is a really super important thing to do, right? And you have to name them right because you want your player object or your ground or whatever to be named appropriately so you can control it. Are you with me? So again, all we've done is create a couple of materials, right? One of them is brown, this light brown color. One of them is green, and this green one is the player. Let's make an enemy, right? I'm just saying. And the enemy is going to be a sphere, right? So we're going to go Shift A. Our cursor should be still in the middle of our screen. Shift A, and we're going to create a UV sphere that's going to go kind of right inside. Right now it's actually appearing inside of our cube. What I want you to do is I want you to pull the UV sphere with the right arrow, or the Y arrow, the green one, towards the top. And if you notice, the UV sphere comes out with no material attached to it. Again, materials right now, there's two. I could assign the same material by going, I'm still clicked on this right material icon, right? I could select one of the materials I've already created, green or light brown. If I choose light brown, right, then it actually changed the shading and the specularity to that material, right? I could do that. Or I could select a brand new material, create one here, by clicking the plus button. If I click the plus button, right, and I want to show you what happens here. See, it's still light brown, right? I'm not creating a new material, so to speak. I'm creating a new slot for materials, because a material, you can have multiple materials for each object. Okay, so right now I've created a new slot, and now I got to choose this new button down here, right, to create the new material. So I've got two. I've got light brown. I've got this other material down here, right? And this other material, I want to make it so that it's red, right? So I'm going to go in my diffuse, and I'm going to kind of choose it so it's very, very red, right? Way down here, red. There's some, not changing the specularity at all. I'm giving it a little bit of reflectivity, if you will. All right. But how come it's not coming up? Well, because the layering of the materials, right? If I want this red material, let me rename this thing. I'm going to rename this thing red, right? Here's red. The reason why red isn't showing up on my sphere over here is because I've got light brown. I selected light brown before it, right? For me to get rid of light brown, I just can choose the minus button on the right hand side here, and now it shows me the red material that I created on the right. Are you with me? So right now, all we've learned is the material gives us color, and material gives us specularity. Those are the two things you should know about material. And it also responds to lighting and shadow, how it lights and shadows, right? Different types of material, which we'll explore later on in the course as we move forward, gives us a different response to lighting and shadow. This is important from a developer perspective to understand, because sometimes you will be given an object and it doesn't light up properly, and it's because of the way the designer created what designer object or designer materials he used for his light and shadow. Again, if I want to turn the specularity off, this is a great example of specularity. Here, how you can see it on the, I'm going to click away. See how you can see it on the sphere? You can actually see the lighting reflect off of the sphere. Now, if I wanted to make the sphere perfectly smooth, because that's what we want to do, I can right click onto it, and on the left hand side, choose smooth. And now if I click away, you can see that my sphere looks more ball-like, right, as opposed to rough the way it worked before. Right? There's my sphere. If I zoom out a little bit, if I move my lighting, right, if you notice, the reflectivity moves wherever the light is realistically. Again, for a 3D free program, it's pretty awesome that it does that. And it calculates all those things, by the way, by using Python on the back end. That's the Python programming language that it uses. And here it goes. I'm going to move it away, way over here. And if you notice, it's pretty dark. And if I move it in, it becomes lighter. I can also move it up, right? Or down, so it becomes very, very intense. Okay, let's move it way up here. So I've got some basic materials and lighting. I want to add another lamp, right? I want to add it in where my cursor is. Let's first make sure that the cursor is at the center. So I'm going to go Shift S. I'm going to say cursor to center. So cursor is at the center. I'm going to add a lamp now. So Shift A when we add stuff. And this time we're going to go down to lamp, right? And I want to add a spot lamp, almost like a spotlight. Okay, cool. Now it's inside of my cube, so you can't see anything. I want to pull my lamp up with my Z arrow, right? And as I pull my lamp up, it starts creating a different kind of lighting effect. Let's take a look, right? Now I get different kinds of shadows in addition to the shadows I'm getting from my other lamp. This lamp is not a point lamp. This one's a spot lamp. So there's going to be shadows outside of the radius of the spot. Make sense? I'm just going to zoom out here so you can see. So this is my lamp, and I can move this anywhere I like to kind of highlight areas, that I want to within my scene. This whole thing, objects, camera, light, they're all part of my scene. And right now my scene is just simply called scene. You can find that right here on the top. It's named scene. I can add additional scenes later on that include different objects, different lighting, and a different kind of camera, right? That's part of my game, right? Each scene is a container object that holds all these other things. All right? So some new things today we talked about before I end this video and take a little bit of a break, right? One, we talked about materials, and the thing I want you guys to know about materials for now, very simple, right, is it creates a little bit of color, right? Two, it adds something called specularity from a gaming perspective, right, which is like reflectivity. You can change the intensity of both the color and the amount of reflectivity or specularity, if you will, for each object, right? Three, there's different kinds of lighting effects. And if you notice, right now I've added a spotlight, and before we just simply had a point lamp, and a point lamp kind of glows evenly all around. You can change the intensity by looking at the energy. And right now I'm kind of clicked on this lamp here, this spot lamp. If I can change the intensity by how bright it is by changing the energy level right here. So if I change this to 5 from 1, it's going to be 5 times as intense. Right? This is a really cool tool when you want to create the way the scene looks. So lighting and objects. Before we end, any questions around this? Igor, I know you're overwhelmed. I can see that there's a lot I've just talked about. It's okay. Just keep working. You're going to be all right, right? One more thing I got to say. Everything right now that works. We've turned on the ability for everything to have shading. At times, especially when you watch these 3D animation short films, you can watch anytime today, anytime you want to in the day. They seem to have less lighting like this, less realistic lighting, and more of a type of shadeless effect, where you can turn the same thing on. For example, if I want to make my player character, let's say this is my player, and I want to make this shadeless, I can simply go down here under shading and choose shadeless. And when I do that, it glows like crazy. Why? Because now it's not going to respond to light at all. It has its own light. It's almost like it emits its own light. And for me to turn that down, I've got to turn how bright this thing is way down my materials so that it's not so bright. It doesn't look realistic though, at all. It takes the realism of the shading away. However, sometimes we need to use something shadeless, especially when you do things like create text. Do we want text to have shade? Like actually like shadows? Because text, we haven't talked about that yet, but text can actually be three-dimensional text, right? But maybe we don't want text to have shading. For example, if you're making a score should not have shadow around it, potentially. You may want to make it shadeless. And that's a good option that's where text and shadowing don't go. Now I want to make shade. If I change this from shadeless back to, I off-click this thing here, click, I'm back to realistic shading. It's on or off, right? I can also make this emit its own light by choosing the emitter right here. If you notice my emitter is 0, so I can make this glow a little bit like this. I can actually increase the glow, kind of an inner glow, if you will, that comes from the actual object itself. So not only does it respond to outer shading, but there's also an inner glow that it has on its own. So an object can actually glow. Cool? Okay, one more piece, and then we'll stop. When we make games, we use bullet physics to do the games. And bullet physics is the same physics engine that we're going to use in Unity, right? And we do the same thing here in Blender, right? So if I want to use bullet physics on the right, so we talked about materials, way on the right over here, right? We can actually choose the type of object this is from a physics perspective. Right now, my main object, this one right here, which is my character, should not be static, but rather be dynamic. Let's make this a dynamic. You can also choose character, but for now let's just choose dynamic. And there's other options here that I'm not going to go into right now. Let's also choose dynamic for my sphere, right? Because my sphere right now says sphere. We're going to change that name to enemy. And let's make this changes from static to dynamic. Okay, so static to dynamic, that's cool. Here's my player. And what I want to do whenever I set up my game, right, is if you look at it from this view, I just rotated my view. See how the left, this Y arrow goes to the left and the red arrow goes to the top? This is the X and Y axis. And this is a great way of looking at it to make sure that I go left or right, up or down, you know, or forward and back, up and down. Right? So try and change your perspective so it looks more like this for a second. Okay. If I click on right-click on my ground, right, my ground, it should stay static. Anything that's static doesn't move in physics in 3D space. However, dynamic objects and rigid objects and soft objects, they move when you start your simulation. All right? Let's talk about that a little bit. So if I just push this object to the side, I'm going to change my perspective. I'm still in this right perspective. I'm going to change this. First of all, let's change the name of this thing from sphere to enemy. Here's my enemy. I want to move this sphere up in three-dimensional space, so it's higher up and maybe a little bit towards the light in here. It's kind of lit up in my three-dimensional world, right? And if you notice here, my player, this is my player object. I'm just going to move him kind of down here. Oops, chose the wrong arrow. I meant this way, right? He's still hovering above my ground, right? Let me just take a look. See, this is below my ground. This is slightly above my ground, if you notice, right? So below my ground, above my ground. But if you notice, the sphere object is way over here, and it's kind of hovering in the air, starting off. Now, this is the challenge. I want you to press the P button. And then what happens? Boom. Let's try that again. Escape, and then press the P button. If you've set everything correctly, you've got physics. P. Boom. Right? Now that doesn't do anything. There's no bounce. There's no movement right now. But I want to get you to give you the idea of how these three-dimensional objects, we created not only materials for them, because they have to have materials for them to have physics on them, right? But also they exist in three-dimensional space, and for the first time ever, this is the first time we've created our three-dimensional world that has three things: our ground, our player, and our enemy, right? And we'll pause it there.